$2 squaw of Hell's Half Acre. Ravenhair's blood price turns Dodge City into a graveyard. Ravenhair had always been a figure of mystery in Dodge City. She wasn't like the women you'd usually see in the bustling streets of the wild town. Her raven-black hair was the first thing that caught anyone's attention. Long, dark, and flowing like the night sky. She wore it with pride, a symbol of her Native American heritage, though that heritage had been ripped from her in ways no one in Dodge could fully understand. Her story began far from the chaos of the dusty streets, in a land where the wind whispered through tall grasses and the mountains stood like silent guards. She had been born to a proud tribe, a peaceful community that valued the earth and its creatures. But her life had been changed forever the day raiders had swept through her village, taking what they wanted and leaving destruction in their wake. Ravenhair, as she came to be known, had been among the unlucky few who were taken, along with other women and children. They were sold into servitude to men who saw them only as possessions. Her captor was a gambler who made his living by tricking and deceiving anyone who crossed his path. He had no respect for life or the value of a person, seeing only profit in every situation. When he laid his eyes on Ravenhair, he saw something else, an opportunity. For only $2 he bought her from the traders like a mere commodity. Life with him was nothing short of torment. The gambler was cruel, a man who spoke little and never showed kindness. He used Ravenhair as a servant, making her clean, cook, and do everything he didn't want to do himself. The men who frequented his gambling den didn't care much for her either. To them, she was just a part of the background, a face that could be ignored, but one that carried a painful story none would ever take the time to listen to. Ravenhair could have let her sorrow consume her. She could have been like the others, silent and resigned to her fate. But something deep inside her burned with a desire to escape, a fierce will to take control of her life once again. Over the years, she learned to survive by becoming invisible to those who had hurt her. She worked in silence, watching every move, planning her way out. No one ever suspected that the quiet, withdrawn woman could ever rise above the life that had been forced upon her. She had learned from the other women she saw, women who had been broken by the same cruelty. They had learned to bend, to survive, but at the cost of their spirit. Ravenhair refused to let that happen to her. She vowed that one day she would leave this life behind. She would make her own way, even if it meant leaving Dodge City behind. The turning point came on a quiet evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. Ravenhair had spent the day cleaning the gambler's shack, her mind constantly racing. She had heard rumors among the men about a large poker game to be held that evening, one with the potential to make or break the gambler's fortune. She saw this as her chance. The gambler would be distracted by his winnings or perhaps by the losses, which would give her the opening she needed. As the night grew darker, the gambler made his way to the saloon, leaving Ravenhair alone in the shack. Her heart raced as she slipped from the shadows. She had no particular destination in mind, just far from here, anywhere she could escape. But the road ahead wasn't easy. Dodge City, with its streets of dust and endless lawlessness, wasn't a place where a woman could easily disappear. It was a town that swallowed those who tried to break free. She gathered what little she had, just a few belongings packed into a small cloth bundle. The gambler would be angry when he returned, but that was something she was willing to face. Anything was better than spending another day in captivity. She carefully opened the door, her heart pounding in her chest, and slipped out into the night. The air was cool, and the night sky above her seemed endless. She felt free for the first time in years, but it wasn't the freedom she had dreamed of. It was only the beginning of a much harder journey. As she moved through the streets of Dodge, she kept to the shadows, avoiding anyone who might see her. She had no friends here, no one to turn to for help. The town was full of strangers, and most of them didn't care to know anyone else. Ravenhair walked through the dark alleys and narrow streets, hoping to stay unnoticed. But as she neared the edge of town, she caught sight of a group of men gathered around a campfire, their laughter echoing in the night. They were outlaws, drifters who had come to Dodge City looking for trouble. She could tell by the way they talked that they were dangerous. The last thing she wanted was to be caught by them, but as she tried to slip past unnoticed, one of them spotted her. "Hey, you!" the man shouted, his voice rough. "Where are you going?" Her heart raced as she turned to face him. The man stood up and started walking toward her, a grin on his face. "Ain't safe for a woman out here at night," he said, his eyes scanning her face. "What's your name, girl?" Ravenhair didn't respond. She had learned long ago that silence could be a weapon, too. But the man wasn't deterred. "What's your name?" he repeated, taking a few steps closer. She knew she had to keep moving. "I have no name for you," she said quietly, her voice steady but cold. The man stopped in his tracks, his smile faltering for a moment. Then he shrugged. "Well, "You're better off away from us anyway," he muttered, turning back to his friends. "Go on, then." Ravenhair didn't waste any time. She hurried away, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't linger in Dodge City any longer. It was a place that had taken everything from her, and she could not allow herself to stay. She needed to get away, to find safety, to heal. As she moved deeper into the night, she vowed that she would make it out. It wouldn't be easy, and she knew that there would be obstacles along the way. But for the first time in years, she felt something stir within her. A hope that maybe, just maybe, she could take control of her life once again. Her escape had begun. The journey ahead would be long and hard, but Ravenhair knew one thing for certain: she would never go back. Ravenhair had escaped the gambler's shack and fled into the night, but she knew her journey had just begun. Dodge City was not a place to trust, not a place where someone like her could simply disappear. As the first few hours of her freedom passed, she could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. She was alone, far from home, and in a town that seemed to swallow anyone who wasn't careful. Her escape had been quick, but now she had to think. She wandered through the quiet streets, moving in the shadows. Dodge City was notorious for its rough crowd, filled with outlaws, gamblers, and people with no love for anyone but themselves. Ravenhair had no money, no plan, and no idea where she could go next. She could hear the distant sounds of the saloons, the laughter, and the clink of glasses, but they didn't comfort her. The noise only reminded her of the life she had left behind, the life she never wanted to go back to. She had heard stories of how the outlaws and drifters roamed the outskirts of the city, hiding from the law, stealing when they could, and sometimes offering help to those in need. But Ravenhair wasn't sure if these people could be trusted. Would they help her, or would they see her as just another victim? She wasn't sure, but she didn't have many choices. She needed food, shelter, and most of all, safety. As she walked past the flickering lights of the saloons, she spotted a small building at the edge of town, a quiet little inn that didn't look like much. It was away from the main hustle of Dodge, tucked in the shadows, almost as if it didn't want to be seen. Ravenhair's heart skipped a beat. Maybe this was the place where she could find some kind of help. She had heard that small inns like this sometimes offered shelter to travelers and people who needed a place to rest. With no better plan, she approached the door and hesitated for a moment. The last thing she wanted was to draw attention to herself. But her feet were aching, her stomach growling with hunger, and her body felt the weight of her exhaustion. She pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with only a few candles flickering on the tables. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the rough wooden walls. A man sat behind a small counter, cleaning a glass. When he saw her, his eyes narrowed, but there was no judgment in them, just a quiet curiosity. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low and calm. Ravenhair hesitated, unsure of what to say. She didn't want to lie, but she didn't want to reveal too much either. "I need a place to stay," she said softly. "Just for the night." The man studied her for a moment, his gaze lingering on her face. Ravenhair held her breath, worried that he might see through her, that he might know she wasn't just another traveler, but a woman on the run. But he simply nodded, as though he had seen many people like her before. "Room's a couple of dollars," he said, sliding the glass aside. "But I can see you've got none. I'm not asking for payment right now. If you need a place to sleep, it's yours. But you work for your stay." Ravenhair was surprised by his words, but she didn't hesitate. She had no choice. "I'll work. I can do anything," she said. The man nodded again and gave her a warm smile. "Good," he said. "We'll see what you're made of." He gave her a small broom and a bucket and showed her to the room. It wasn't much, just a simple cot, a small table, and a chair, but it was enough. Ravenhair didn't care about luxuries. She just needed a place where she could rest, even if it was only for a short time. She set down her bundle and quickly got to work, sweeping the floor and wiping down the tables. She was good at this kind of work, having spent years cleaning the gambler's shack. But here, it felt different. She wasn't cleaning for someone who would shout at her or punish her for doing something wrong. She was doing it for herself. As the night wore on, Ravenhair stayed busy. She cleaned, tidied, and made sure everything was in place. The man who ran the inn didn't talk much, but he didn't need to. He watched her work, then disappeared into the back room. Ravenhair didn't mind the silence. It gave her a chance to think. She couldn't stay here forever, she knew that. She had to leave Dodge City, but where would she go? She couldn't go back to the gambler. She could never face that life again. The thought of returning to that place where she had been nothing more than a servant, a possession, made her feel sick to her stomach. But she had no family, no friends, and no place to call home. The world outside Dodge was dangerous, and every step she took brought her closer to the unknown. As she worked through the night, Ravenhair's thoughts turned to the road ahead. She knew that she couldn't stay in the inn forever, even if it offered her safety for the moment. She would need to leave, and when she did, she would need to be ready to face whatever came next. At dawn, the man returned to check on her. Ravenhair was still cleaning, though she was beginning to feel the weight of her exhaustion. But there was something in his eyes when he looked at her. A quiet respect, maybe even a hint of understanding. "You're good at this," he said, glancing around the room. "I can tell you've done this before." "I've had to," Ravenhair replied simply, her voice quiet but strong. The man nodded. "Well, you've earned your rest," he said. "You can stay here for as long as you need. But don't make it too long. Dodge City's a dangerous place, and I don't want you getting caught up in something you don't understand." Ravenhair thanked him softly, feeling the weight of his words. She had to get out. She couldn't afford to stay in Dodge City too long. Every moment she spent here, she risked being found. She had to keep moving, to keep looking for a way out, to find a place where she could start anew. But for now, she had a roof over her head and a chance to rest. It was more than she had hoped for when she first stepped into the city. She would take what she could get and use it to prepare for what lay ahead. As she lay down on the cot, closing her eyes for the first time in what felt like forever, Ravenhair allowed herself a brief moment of peace, but deep inside she knew that her journey was far from over. The road ahead would be long and full of danger, but she was determined. She would find a way out of this life, and she would make sure that no one would ever have the power to control her again. Ravenhair's time at the small inn in Dodge City gave her a brief moment of peace, but deep inside she knew that peace would not last. She couldn't stay there forever. She had escaped the gambler's grip, but now she had to find a way to truly escape Dodge City, the town that held more danger than she could imagine. Every day she spent in the city, the more likely it became that someone would recognize her, someone who might be willing to turn her in for the right price. The man who ran the inn had been kind, but his warnings about Dodge City were not to be taken lightly. She had heard the whispers of the lawless nature of the town. Outlaws roamed the streets, and the lawmen were only interested in their own power. Even the town's sheriff had a reputation for being more of a soldier than a protector, quick to act with violence rather than reason. Ravenhair knew she couldn't stay in the inn any longer than necessary. She needed to make a plan. Her escape from the gambler had been a small victory, but she hadn't truly won her freedom yet. She had to get away from Dodge City, to find somewhere safe where no one knew her name, no one could use her for their own gain. The next few days passed in a blur of cleaning, working, and watching the people come and go. The man who ran the inn remained quiet, but she could tell he was growing concerned. He warned her once more to stay low, to keep her head down and not to attract attention. He told her that the city had eyes everywhere, that nothing stayed hidden for long. Ravenhair couldn't argue with that. It seemed like every time she stepped outside, the shadows of the city seemed to close in around her. But she couldn't let fear control her. She had already survived far too much to let fear stop her now. She knew she needed help if she was going to leave the city, and it wasn't going to come from staying locked away in the inn. One evening, as she cleaned the windows of the inn, she caught sight of something that gave her hope. Across the street, she noticed a group of people gathered around a campfire. They weren't outlaws, not like the ones she had seen earlier, but they didn't seem to belong to the law either. There were men and women, drifters like her, gathered in small groups, talking in low voices. They looked tired, but there was something different about them. They weren't part of the usual crowd that filled the saloons. They weren't dangerous, or at least not in the same way. Ravenhair watched them for a while, trying to figure out if they could help her, if they could offer any kind of support. She needed information, any information that could lead her to a way out of the city. After a long time of watching from her spot in the inn, she decided to take a chance. She gathered her courage, slipped on her cloak, and quietly made her way across the street. The campfire was surrounded by a few people, all of them sitting on crates or leaning against the walls of nearby buildings. Their faces were tired, but there was no fear in their eyes, no sign that they were the type to cause trouble. Ravenhair approached the group, her heart pounding. She didn't know what she was doing or what kind of reception she'd get, but she had to try. She couldn't do this alone. One of the men noticed her first. He was tall, with a rugged face and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. He didn't speak right away, but just studied her with an expression that was hard to read. He seemed to sense that she wasn't just another passerby, that she was carrying something heavier, something that didn't belong to the ordinary troubles of Dodge City. "Looking for something, miss?" the man asked in a low voice, his tone careful but not unkind. Ravenhair swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "I need help," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I need to get out of here." He didn't ask her what she meant by getting out or why she wanted to leave. He just seemed to know that she had a reason for her desperation. He glanced over at the others in the group, a few of whom were watching quietly. After a brief exchange of glances, the man stood and walked toward her. "You're not the first to want to leave Dodge," he said. "And you won't be the last. But it's not easy. The roads out of here aren't safe, especially not for someone like you. There are men who would try to take advantage of you on the way out." Ravenhair nodded. She knew the dangers, but she had no choice. She couldn't stay in Dodge any longer. She had to leave, even if it meant facing whatever dangers lay on the road ahead. The man seemed to understand her resolve, and after a moment's pause, he spoke again. "If you're serious about leaving, we can help," he said. "But it won't be simple. We're not a group of thieves or outlaws. We don't deal in that kind of thing. But we know the land, and we know the safe paths out of here." Ravenhair's heart leapt. She hadn't expected help to come so easily. She didn't know whether she could trust these people completely, but they had offered a lifeline. "I don't have much," she said, her voice steady now. "But I can work. I can help in any way I can." The man nodded, his face softening. "We don't take payment in gold or silver. We take payment in loyalty. You help us, and we help you." She knew that in a world like this, loyalty was worth more than anything money could buy. She agreed. And just like that, her path out of Dodge City had been set in motion. For the next few days, Ravenhair worked alongside the group, helping them with whatever tasks were needed. They weren't doing anything illegal, but they were always moving quietly, keeping to the shadows. She learned that they were part of a larger network of people who traveled across the country, moving from place to place, helping those who couldn't help themselves. They weren't outlaws, but they weren't exactly law-abiding citizens either. They operated in the space between, doing what they could to survive in a world that seemed to reward the strong and punish the weak. As Ravenhair grew more comfortable with the group, she learned that the leader, the man who had first spoken to her, had a name: Jack. He had been part of this group for years, and while he didn't share many details about his past, Ravenhair could tell that he was a man who understood hardship. It wasn't long before Jack pulled her aside. "It's time," he said. "We've found a route for you. It's not perfect, but it's the safest we can offer. You'll need to leave at dawn." Ravenhair nodded, her heart racing with both excitement and fear. This was it. She was finally leaving Dodge City, the place that had been nothing but pain and fear for so long. And yet, even as she prepared to leave, she couldn't help but wonder what awaited her on the other side of the city. The road ahead was full of unknowns, but Ravenhair was ready to face them. She had made it this far. Now, it was time to finally be free. The morning came quickly, and with it, Ravenhair's chance to finally leave Dodge City. She had spent the last few days preparing for the journey, learning the best routes to take, and planning for the unknowns that lay ahead. She had been careful, watching every move, and listening closely to the warnings of those around her. It was time to go, but the feeling of uncertainty still weighed heavily on her. Would she really be safe? Would she ever truly escape the shadows of the city? Jack, the man who had helped her, came to her early that morning, just as the sun began to rise. The others in the group were already up, packing their things quietly. There was no time to waste. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, and they had to make it out of Dodge City before anyone noticed they were gone. "We move quickly," Jack said in a low voice, looking round to ensure no one else was listening. "Stay close, and don't speak unless you need to. The road ahead isn't safe, and we can't afford to attract attention." Ravenhair nodded. She had heard the warnings before, and she understood the importance of staying under the radar. Dodge City was full of dangers, and even the smallest mistake could lead to trouble. The last thing she wanted was to be caught before she had a chance to leave. The group moved through the streets of Dodge City like shadows, blending in with the early morning fog. The streets were quieter than usual, as most people were still asleep or recovering from the late-night chaos that often filled the town. They passed by the saloons, the gambling halls, and the dusty roads, each step taking them further away from the life Ravenhair had known. It felt strange, like she was walking away from something that had been a part of her for so long, but she knew it was the right thing to do. As they reached the outskirts of town, Jack led them down a narrow path that wound its way through the hills and toward the open plains. The land was empty, vast, and silent. Ravenhair had never seen the world this way before. She had spent so many years in the chaos of Dodge City, always surrounded by people, always in the noise and confusion. Now the world seemed so different, so still. It was as if the land itself was waiting for her to take the next step. The journey was harder than Ravenhair had anticipated. The path was rough, with thorny bushes and jagged rocks that made walking difficult. Her feet grew sore and the sun beat down on them relentlessly, but she kept moving, step by step. She couldn't afford to stop. Not now. As the day wore on, the group stopped to rest by a small stream. Ravenhair sat on a large rock, staring at the water as it flowed gently by. It was strange to think that this was her life now, no longer under the control of the gambler, no longer trapped in Dodge City. She felt both free and uncertain, as though she was standing on the edge of something new, something that could change everything. Jack sat down beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You're doing well," he said quietly. "It's not easy, but you've made it farther than most would." Ravenhair looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had never met anyone who had shown her kindness in the way Jack had. He didn't ask for anything in return, didn't question her past. He had simply offered his help when she needed it most. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said softly. "Thank you," Jack smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "We all have our battles," he said. "But you've got a strength in you, I can see that." The rest of the group was gathering their things, preparing to move on. Ravenhair knew they couldn't linger for too long. Every minute they stayed in one place was a risk, and they had to keep moving if they were going to stay ahead of anyone who might be looking for them. The group continued on, following the narrow trail that led them further into the wilderness. As the hours passed, Ravenhair's body grew tired, and the landscape began to change. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills and rocky outcrops. The world around them was wild, untouched by the chaos of Dodge City. It was beautiful in its own rugged way. Ravenhair had never known a world like this before. As night fell, the group set up camp. They built a small fire and sat around it, eating what little food they had brought with them. Ravenhair could see the weariness in everyone's eyes, but there was a sense of calm, too. They weren't in Dodge City anymore, and that alone made the journey feel worthwhile. Ravenhair sat quietly by the fire, her thoughts drifting. She thought about her past, about the years she had spent as the gambler's captive. She thought about the women she had met along the way, women who had been broken by the same kind of life, and she thought about the future, about what it might hold now that she had taken the first step toward freedom. The fire crackled in front of her, and she allowed herself a moment of peace. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance, a real chance. She didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid to face it. Jack sat down beside her again, his gaze distant. "Tomorrow will be a harder day," he said. "But you're stronger than you think." Ravenhair nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She was afraid of what lay ahead, of the dangers that still lurked in the world. But she wasn't afraid of herself anymore. She had fought for her freedom, and now she was walking the path to find it. There was no turning back. As the fire burned down to embers, the group settled down to sleep. Ravenhair lay on the ground, staring up at the stars. The night was clear and cold, but she felt safe. She had made it out of Dodge City, and though the journey was far from over, she had finally taken control of her own fate. The road ahead was unknown, full of dangers and challenges, but Ravenhair was no longer the frightened girl who had been trapped in a life of servitude. She was a woman on a mission, a woman determined to forge her own future. Tomorrow, they would continue their journey, and no matter what came next, Ravenhair knew she was ready. The journey was long and unforgiving, but Ravenhair had grown stronger with each passing day. The wilderness around her seemed to stretch endlessly, offering both beauty and danger. The road to freedom wasn't easy, and it never would be, but each day she walked further away from Dodge City, away from the life she had once known. She was free, but the weight of her freedom didn't come without its challenges. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, Ravenhair noticed the group becoming more cautious. Jack, the leader, was always scanning the horizon, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of danger. The other members of the group, though quiet, seemed to share his unease. They were all survivors, each with their own story, and none of them trusted the world outside the protection of the small campfires they built at night. Ravenhair had learned that, in this world, trust was something you had to earn. It wasn't given freely, not in a place like this. She had seen the harshness of life in Dodge City, and she knew that even the kindest of people could be forced to do things they would never want to do. She had learned to be cautious, to keep her emotions guarded, and to always keep moving forward. The days blended together, hot and dry, with little to look at except the wide-open plains and the occasional cluster of trees. Ravenhair's body had grown accustomed to the hard work. She carried her own weight now, helping the group with whatever tasks needed doing, setting up camp, gathering firewood, and watching over the horses. The work wasn't easy, but it was something she could do, and doing it made her feel useful. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. But even with all the progress she had made, Ravenhair couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. The further they traveled, the more she realized that Dodge City's shadows didn't simply disappear. They followed her, lingering in her thoughts, reminding her that the dangers of the past could catch up with her at any moment. It wasn't long before her fears were realized. One evening, as the group sat around their campfire, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. Ravenhair froze, her senses alert. The group fell silent, all eyes on Jack, who had already stood up, his hand resting on the handle of his rifle. He motioned for everyone to be quiet, signaling them to gather their things quickly. "What is it?" Ravenhair whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. Jack didn't answer at first, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Then he spoke in a low, steady voice. "We're being followed. Someone's been tracking us." Ravenhair's stomach dropped. She had hoped to leave Dodge City and its dangers behind, but it seemed that her past was never far enough away to truly escape. "Who is it?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Jack hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the darkness. "I don't know, but we can't take any chances." The group quickly packed up, moving with practiced efficiency. Ravenhair felt a rush of fear mixed with adrenaline. She had spent so long running from her past, and now it was catching up to her. Her heart raced as she thought of the gambler, of the people he might have sent after her. Was this the end of her journey? Was she doomed to live a life always looking over her shoulder, never able to find true peace? The sound of hooves grew louder, and Jack motioned for the group to move out. They didn't run, not yet. Instead, they began to make their way through the trees, moving silently, hoping to lose whoever was following them. Ravenhair's mind raced with questions, but there was no time for answers. The only thing that mattered now was survival. As they moved deeper into the woods, Ravenhair could hear the sound of the riders getting closer. She could feel the tension in the air, thick with the fear of what might happen next. Would they be caught? Would they be forced to fight their way out? The group continued to move silently through the trees, staying low and avoiding any noise that could give them away. Ravenhair's breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to keep up with the others, her legs aching from the long hours of travel. She didn't dare look back, but she could sense the danger approaching, just behind them, waiting for the right moment to strike. It felt like hours before the group finally stopped, hidden behind a cluster of thick bushes. Jack held up a hand, signaling everyone to stay still. Ravenhair crouched down beside him, her body tense with fear. She could hear the riders now, the sound of their horses' hooves thundering through the forest, their voices calling to one another. Whoever they were getting closer, and there was no way to hide forever. Jack motioned to the others to spread out, taking positions around the camp. Ravenhair stayed close to him, her eyes scanning the dark woods for any sign of movement. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was it. She had escaped Dodge City, but the world was a dangerous place. No one was ever truly safe. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the riders stopped. Ravenhair's heart skipped a beat as she waited, trying to make sense of what was happening. She heard the sound of voices in the distance, but they were too far away for her to understand what was being said. Jack was still, his eyes locked on the shadows, waiting for the riders to make their next move. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. The group held their breath, waiting, hoping that the riders would move on. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jack made a decision. "We move," he whispered. The group sprang into action, moving swiftly and silently through the trees. Ravenhair's heart was pounding in her chest, but she kept her focus on the path ahead. This wasn't the time to stop. Not now, not when they were so close to escaping. They had made it this far, and they couldn't let fear stop them now. As they moved through the woods, the sound of the riders faded behind them. The group didn't stop until they reached a small, hidden valley, far from the dangers of the open road. Jack gave the signal to stop, and they all collapsed on the ground, exhausted and relieved. "We made it," Jack said, his voice low but steady. "For now." Ravenhair sat down beside the fire, her mind still racing. The threat had passed, but she knew they couldn't let their guard down. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. They had made it this far together. They were survivors. Ravenhair looked around at the group, at the people who had helped her, and she realized something. No matter how difficult the journey, no matter how dangerous the road ahead, she was no longer alone. She had found her place among these people, and together they would face whatever came next.